The Hôtel de la Seine had always been an unremarkable establishment, its corridors filled with the quiet shuffle of weary travellers, and its rooms hosting transient souls who left no trace of their passing. It was not the kind of place that attracted scandal, nor the kind of clientele that would welcome one. But on a damp November evening, Room 12 became the epicenter of a crime so inexplicable that even the most seasoned officers hesitated before stepping across its threshold. Inspector Jules Verneuil arrived just past midnight, summoned from his apartment with little more than an urgent phone call and the promise of something he had to see to believe. He found the hallway outside Room 12 brimming with subdued chatter, hotel staff speaking in hushed tones, 2 uniformed policemen blocking entry, and the concierge, Monsieur Leclerc, wringing his hands as though he feared his establishment might crumble beneath the weight of the night's events. "Inspector," Leclerc murmured, stepping aside with a deference reserved for priests or executioners. I don't know what to make of it." Verneuil nodded, his sharp eyes already scanning the room beyond. The lamp on the nightstand flickered, casting shadows across the thick drapes that covered the sole window. The bed was unmade, but bore no sign of struggle. On the floor, near the writing desk, lay the body of a man, middle-aged, well-dressed, and utterly lifeless. Dr. Moreau, the coroner, was crouched beside the corpse, his fingers pressed against the man's pale throat. He glanced up as Verneuil entered. No wounds, no sign of forced entry, nothing that suggests foul play, yet... He gestured toward the dead man's face. The expression. It's as if he saw something terrifying just before. "He died." Verneuil crouched, studying the victim's rigid features. The man's mouth was slightly open, his lips frozen mid-gasp. His wide, unblinking eyes stared at something unseen, something beyond the room's dim glow. A silent scream. "No struggle?" Verneuil asked. "None," Moreau confirmed. Yet his pulse simply stopped. "I'll need to conduct a full examination, but for now there's nothing that suggests why." Verneuil's gaze swept the room, searching for an explanation where none should exist. The door had been locked from the inside, requiring the hotel staff to break it down. The only window, though shut, showed no signs of tampering. And yet a man had perished without cause, without witness, and with an expression of pure horror etched onto his face. It was then that Verneuil noticed the curtain. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, heavy, velvet, the kind found in hotels seeking to maintain an air of faded grandeur. But something about its position seemed wrong. He stepped forward, brushing his fingers against the fabric. It moved easily, swaying slightly as though a draught had stirred it, though the window behind it was firmly shut. And then he saw it. Pinned to the inner lining of the curtain was a single playing card, the King of Spades. Verneuil plucked it free, turning it between his fingers. The edges were crisp as though newly placed. The back bore no markings, no hotel insignia, nothing to suggest where it had come from. He turned to the concierge. "Monsieur Leclerc?" Was this part of the room's décor? Leclerc paled, shaking his head so vehemently his glasses slipped down his nose. "No, Inspector, we do not keep playing cards in the rooms." "Then someone placed it here." Verneuil turned the card over once more. A man locked in a room with no exit, a heart that ceased to beat without cause, and a cryptic card hidden behind the curtain. He had seen many crimes, solved cases that baffled lesser minds, but this was something different. The King of Spades was not a clue, it was a message, and whoever had sent it wanted him to understand. Inspector Jules Verneuil turned the playing card between his fingers, its edges crisp beneath his touch. The King of Spades. A message. But from whom? And why? The questions tightened around his mind like the damp November air pressing against the hotel's walls. He slid the card into his coat pocket and turned to the room's silent audience. The coroner, the policeman, the concierge, each watched, him with a mix of expectation and unease. Routine had failed them. Now they awaited something else. Insight. Direction. Verneuil exhaled slowly. Who was the victim? Leclerc cleared his throat. A Monsieur Lucien Armand. He checked in 2 nights ago, paid in advance, no special requests, kept to himself. No visitors? None that we saw. Verneuil's gaze drifted back to the body. Lucien Armand. The name was familiar, though he couldn't place it. He crouched beside the dead man once more, careful not to disturb anything. The suit was tailored, but not extravagant. The watch on his wrist was expensive, but old, its leather strap cracked with age. A man of means, but not of vanity. He examined the nightstand. A book lay open, its spine facing upward. Les Liaisons Dangereuses. A peculiar choice. Not light reading, yet the bookmark suggested he had only just begun. Beside it, a half-finished glass of cognac. The liquid inside remained undisturbed. Verneuil leaned closer. The air carried no hint of poison, no strange aroma beyond the fading traces of Armand's cologne. He gestured to Moreau. Was he drinking this when he died? Moreau examined the glass, then the body. Possible, but unlikely. The rigor suggests he died at least an hour ago. If he were drinking, I'd expect the glass to be somewhere less. Deliberately placed. Deliberately placed. The phrase sat uncomfortably in Verneuil's mind. Nothing about the scene felt rushed or chaotic. The room was too neat, too composed. If Armand had died in sudden terror, wouldn't there be more evidence of it? A fallen chair? A spilled drink? Instead, everything remained in its proper place, except the playing card. He rose, scanning the room once more, searching for something. That felt out of place. His gaze settled on the window. The curtains swayed gently, still reacting to the motion of his touch from moments before. He stepped closer, pressing a palm against the glass. Cold. No sign it had been opened, yet a subtle film of condensation suggested someone had been near it recently, their breath mingling with the chill outside. He turned back to Leclerc. Who discovered the body? The concierge hesitated. One of the maids, Colette. She knocked for housekeeping. When there was no response, she used her pass key. She's still here? She was quite shaken, Inspector. Leclerc gestured toward the hallway. She's in the staff room, gathering herself. Verneuil nodded, stepping, past the others and out into the dimly lit corridor. The hotel's decor was aged but well-maintained, wood panelling, deep green carpeting, sconces that flickered with an uneven glow. It was the kind of place that prided itself on discretion, where secrets could settle into the walls and remain undisturbed for years. The staff room door was ajar, revealing a modest space lined with lockers and a small table stacked with linens. A young woman sat on the bench, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. She looked up as Verneuil entered, her eyes wide, rimmed red. "Your Colette?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Oui, monsieur. I understand this was upsetting for you," he continued, lowering himself onto the bench across from her. "But I need to ask you about what you saw." Colette swallowed hard. "I knocked, like always." No answer, I thought maybe he'd gone out, but the door wasn't latched properly, just locked. Verneuil's brow furrowed. What do you mean? The key turned easily, like someone had locked it, but not fully closed the door. That was unusual. If Armand had locked himself in, the door should have been shut tight. If someone else had done it, why wouldn't they ensure it was properly secured? A mistake? Or a message, just like the card? Colette exhaled sharply. I pushed it open just a little, then I saw him. She shuddered. His eyes. Verneuil let the silence settle before asking, Did you touch anything? No, I ran straight to Monsieur Leclerc. He watched her closely. She was young, perhaps no older than 20, and her fear seemed genuine. But something was off. Her hands trembled, not just from shock, but from something deeper. Hesitation, maybe. A secret. You've worked here long? 2 years. You see a lot of guests come and go, she nodded. Did you ever see Monsieur Armand with anyone? Flicker of something crossed her face, brief but unmistakable. She hesitated just a second too long before answering. No, not that I recall. Verneuil leaned forward, lowering his voice. Colette, I believe you, but I also believe you saw something that doesn't make sense to you. Maybe it didn't seem important at the time. But now... She bit her lip. Her hands tightened around the handkerchief. I don't know if it means anything, she whispered. But last night, when I brought fresh towels, the curtain was open. Verneuil felt his pulse quicken. And tonight? Closed. Completely. She looked at him helplessly. That's all. I thought maybe he just wanted privacy, a small detail, a nearly imperceptible change, but someone had touched that curtain between last night and now. Someone had left a message, and whoever it was, they were still close. Verneuil studied Colette's face, the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief tighter with each passing second. The small change in the curtain's position, something another maid might not have noticed, something a guilty person might overlook, stood out as a quiet inconsistency, a wrinkle in an otherwise smooth surface. It was the kind of detail that mattered. "You're sure it was closed when you found the body?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Inspector, shut tight. Did Monsieur Armand speak to you at all? Did he seem nervous?" Colette's lips pressed together, her gaze dropping to the floor. Not nervous, just distant, like his mind was somewhere else. Did he ever receive messages? Letters? A visitor? This time, her hesitation stretched longer, her fingers clutching the handkerchief as though it might shield her from whatever she was about to say. She stopped herself, glancing toward the door, her voice dropping to a whisper. Madame Fournier might know. She's the one who works the late shift. Verneuil followed her gaze. The staff door remained slightly ajar, allowing the hum of the hotel's evening routine to slip in. The distant murmur of guests, the rhythmic clinking of dishes from the dining hall. Someone could be listening. He rose, offering her a small nod. "You've been helpful, Colette. Try to get some rest." She exhaled as if relieved, but said nothing more. Verneuil stepped back into the corridor, his mind already assembling the pieces. The curtain, the unlocked door, the playing card. It was too deliberate to be random. Someone had been inside that room after Armand died. Someone had arranged the scene, left a message, perhaps a warning. Madame Fournier was at the reception desk when he found her, a woman in her late 50s, with sharp features and an expression that suggested she had spent too many years pretending to be polite. She raised an eyebrow as he approached. "You're the inspector." It wasn't a question. Verneuil nodded. "And you're the one who worked the desk last night." "I was." "Tell me about Monsieur Armand." Fournier's mouth tightened. "Not much to tell. He came and went like any guest. Didn't ask for much. Always locked his door." "But someone visited him, didn't they?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Just a moment of irritation, quickly smoothed over. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" She exhaled sharply. "A man came by last night. Tall, dark coat, one of those expensive ones. Didn't give a name, just asked for room 12. "And you let him in?" "Of course not." She folded her arms. "Hotel policy, but I saw him again later, in the hall, near the stairs." "Like he was waiting for something." Verneuil's pulse quickened. "Did Armand leave his room at any point?" "Not that I saw. A man waiting outside room 12, watching, possibly listening." "But had he gone inside? If so, how?" "The door had been locked from within." Verneuil tapped his fingers against the counter, thinking. "Did you see this man leave?" "No." Her brow furrowed. "That's the strange part. I was at the desk all night, and I would have seen him go." Verneuil's mind churned. If the visitor never left through the main entrance, he either found another way out, or he was still here. Before he could speak, footsteps echoed down the hallway. He turned just as a well-dressed man approached, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His posture was impeccable, his face composed, but Verneuil recognized the type instantly. Wealth, influence, a man who rarely heard the word no. He stopped in front of the inspector, offering a polite but distant smile. "Inspector Verneuil, I presume?" Verneuil studied him before answering. "That depends. Who's asking?" The man extended a hand. "Henri Belmont. I represent the Armand family." Verneuil did not shake it. "That was fast." Belmont withdrew his hand without offence. "Lucien's brother, Edouard, was informed of his passing earlier this evening. He asked me to handle matters. I arrived as soon as I could." Verneuil noted the wording. "Not shocked by his death, not distraught, just informed. Did you know Lucien personally?" "We met a handful of times. My firm handled some of his investments." "Then you must know if he had enemies." Belmont's expression didn't shift, but there was the faintest pause before he answered. "None that I can think of." A lie, or at least a carefully chosen omission. "You're certain?" Verneuil pressed. Belmont smiled, polite as ever. "I deal in facts, Inspector. If I knew of anything relevant, I'd tell you." Verneuil let the silence stretch between them, watching for cracks, but Belmont held firm. Finally, the inspector nodded. "In that case, you won't mind if I check something?" Belmont tilted his head slightly. "Check what exactly?" Verneuil pulled the playing card from his coat pocket and held it up. "Tell me, Monsieur Belmont, what do you make of this?" For the first time, Belmont's composure faltered. It was subtle. A flicker of recognition in his eyes, a tightening of the jaw, barely a second. But it was there. "I wouldn't know," he said smoothly. "A playing card?" "A very specific one," Verneuil countered. "The King of Spades. Found in Armand's room, pinned behind the curtain." Belmont's smile didn't return. Verneuil tucked the card back into his pocket. "One last question. You said you arrived as soon as you could. Where exactly were you coming from?" Belmont hesitated just long enough for Verneuil to notice. "A dinner engagement." "With whom?" "Clients." Verneuil waited. Belmont didn't elaborate. "Would you mind if I verify that?" This time, Belmont's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I mind very much, Inspector." Verneuil held his gaze, feeling the weight of the game between them. Someone had placed that card in Armand's room. Someone had been waiting outside his door. And now, standing before him, was a man who recognized a message he claimed to have never seen. The first real deception of the night had just surfaced. Verneuil watched Belmont closely, weighing the lie that had just settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were small but telling. Belmont had recognized the King of Spades, and yet he pretended not to. That meant something. The trick was determining what. A dinner engagement, he'd said, with clients. It was vague, deliberately so. A man like Belmont would be precise in his affairs, times, locations, names. His reluctance to provide details suggested he was hiding something. But what? A direct connection to Armand's murder? Or just a business dealing he wished to keep discreet? Verneuil took his time, slipping the playing card back into his pocket, giving Belmont space to speak, to attempt an explanation. But the man said nothing, merely adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as though the conversation bored him. "I assume Edouard Armand will be arriving soon?" Verneuil asked, shifting tactics. Belmont's posture relaxed slightly, as if grateful for the change of subject. "Tomorrow morning. He is understandably distraught. And yet he sent you ahead to handle things. A family friend, I take it?" "I manage his financial interests," Belmont corrected smoothly. "Lucien's as well at times. That was new." "So you did have a professional relationship with the deceased?" "Occasionally," Belmont offered a thin smile. "But you misunderstand, Inspector. I handled investments. I'm no more involved in this tragedy than the concierge who checked him in." Verneuil let that remark linger before replying, "Except the concierge didn't flinch at the sight of a playing card." Belmont's smile barely wavered. "You must be mistaken." Verneuil had seen enough. Belmont was too composed for a man, with nothing to hide. Perhaps he hadn't killed Armand, but he knew more than he let on. The trick would be pulling at the right thread. "Don't leave town just yet, Monsieur Belmont," Verneuil said, turning away. "I may have more questions." Belmont inclined his head slightly, neither confirming nor refusing. The inspector left the reception area, his mind working through the tangled possibilities. He needed more, a clearer motive, a stronger connection. Belmont was part of this puzzle, but he wasn't the only piece. Returning to room 12, Verneuil found Moreau waiting inside, leaning against the writing desk. "Well?" Moreau asked. "Did our well-dressed visitor have anything useful to say?" He recognized the playing card. Moreau's brows lifted. "Interesting. Any idea why?" "Not yet. But I'm certain it wasn't just a coincidence." Verneuil scanned the room again, his mind turning over what he knew so far. A locked door murder, a misplaced playing card, a visitor seen lurking outside, and now Belmont's curious reaction. None of it fit neatly together, but pieces were starting to connect. He turned to Moreau. "Did you dig into Armand's background?" Moreau nodded. "Worked in finance, but not the kind that makes the papers. Private deals, offshore accounts, the sort of things that keep money moving quietly." "Shady dealings?" "Possibly, but nothing illegal on record." Moreau hesitated before adding, "There is one thing, though. 2 months ago, Lucien liquidated a large portion of his assets. Cashed out in a hurry. No clear reason why." Verneuil frowned. "Someone after him?" "Could be. He also withdrew a sizable sum in cash. Again, no explanation. A man moving large amounts of money, seemingly in a rush. That smelled of either desperation or fear. Could Belmont have handled any of that?" Verneuil asked. It's possible, but if he did, he'd never admit it. Verneuil exhaled. Then we need to find someone who will. The answer, it turned out, came from an unlikely source. Colette had been hesitant before, but when Verneuil found her again in the laundry room, she was fidgeting, looking as though she had something else to say. "You remembered something," he guessed. She nodded, biting her lip. "It might not be important, but last night I saw Monsieur Armand in the hallway. He was speaking to someone." Verneuil's pulse quickened. "Who? A woman," she hesitated. "I only caught a glimpse, but she was elegant, well-dressed. They weren't arguing, but she seemed upset." "Did you hear what they said?" "Only part of it." She asked him, "Are you sure?" And he said, "It's the only way." Verneuil leaned forward. "Did you recognize her?" "No, but she wasn't a guest. That meant she had come from outside, deliberately to see Armand. Another secret meeting. Another piece of the puzzle. If Armand had been arranging something, making a decision that required secrecy, then the money, the playing card, and his death were all connected. But how? And more importantly, who had the most to lose if that secret came out? The breakthrough came faster than Verneuil expected. It was Moreau who delivered the news, striding into the inspector's office at the precinct with a smug satisfaction that usually meant bad news for someone else. "We got him," Moreau declared, tossing a file onto the desk. Verneuil arched an eyebrow but didn't reach for it immediately. "Who?" "Felix Lambert." The name was unfamiliar. "And who exactly is Felix Lambert?" "A low-level enforcer. He's done work for loan sharks, smuggled goods across borders. Nothing big enough to land him in prison for long, but here's the interesting part. His prints were found in room 12. That got Verneuil's attention. "Where?" "On the window latch." Verneuil frowned, leaning back in his chair. "So he entered through the window?" Moreau nodded. "We checked the fire escape. It's possible he climbed up, entered, and killed Armand before slipping out the same way. No need for a key, no locked room mystery." It was a neat solution. Too neat. "Motive?" Verneuil asked. Moreau flipped open the file. Armand was in debt. Deep debt. Lambert worked for one of his creditors. That was new. And yet he still had enough money to withdraw large sums recently. Maybe that's why he was killed. He had the money, but he wasn't paying up. It was plausible. Debts had led to murders before, but Verneuil had a nagging feeling, a misalignment between the crime and the man being blamed for it. "And where is Lambert now?" Moreau grinned. "In custody. Picked him up at a cafe near the docks. He didn't put up a fight. That was another problem. If a man like Lambert had broken into a hotel room, murdered someone over money, and then fled, why would he be sitting calmly in a cafe afterward? Why not leave town?" Verneuil tapped a finger against the desk. "Has he confessed?" "No, but he's not exactly protesting either. Just sitting there waiting." "Waiting for what?" Moreau shrugged. "Maybe for a deal, or maybe he just knows he's finished." Verneuil stood, grabbing his coat. "Let's go ask him." At the precinct, Lambert sat in the interrogation room with the unbothered air of a man who had already decided how this would play out. He was lean, with the kind of face that had seen too many fights and too few victories. His hands were cuffed. In front of him, his fingers tapping idly on the metal table. Verneuil sat across from him, meeting his gaze. "You know why you're here?" Lambert smirked. "So they tell me." "Lucien Armand." "Room 12. Your fingerprints." Lambert exhaled through his nose, amused rather than nervous. "Never said I was careful." Verneuil tilted his head. "You're not denying it?" Why would I? Moreau crossed his arms, watching from the corner. Because it's murder, Lambert shrugged. That what you're calling it? Verneuil studied him. The man wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He wasn't acting like someone who had just been caught for murder. He was playing a role, but it wasn't that of a killer. You were in that room, Verneuil said, testing him. Tell me what happened. Lambert leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. Either way, it don't matter, does it? Verneuil let silence stretch between them, waiting. Most people would rush to fill it, to explain, to defend themselves. But Lambert just sat there, watching him with the patience of someone who knew something Verneuil didn't. The inspector leaned forward. You didn't kill him? A flicker of something, amusement maybe, crossed Lambert's face. That's so. If you had, you wouldn't be sitting here. You wouldn't be this calm. Lambert's fingers stopped tapping, just for a second. Then they resumed the same slow rhythm. Moreau sighed. Enough games, Lambert. Your prints were there, and we know Armand owed money. It's over. Lambert exhaled, shaking his head. You boys really want this to be simple, don't you? Verneuil's mind turned over the facts again. The crime scene, the playing card, Belmont's reaction, the unknown woman. No, it wasn't simple. He leaned back. You didn't kill him, he said again, but you were there. Lambert gave a lazy shrug. Maybe, Verneuil pressed on. What were you looking for? This time, Lambert's smirk faltered. He masked it quickly, but Verneuil saw the hesitation, the tiny moment of uncertainty. Moreau scoffed. He wasn't looking for anything. He was there to collect. Verneuil shook his head. No. If it was just about the money, Armand would have been beaten, not killed. This wasn't a warning. It was a message. He locked eyes with Lambert. What was taken? Lambert didn't answer. Moreau sighed. What does it matter? We have our man. But Verneuil wasn't so sure. If Lambert had been searching for something, that meant Armand had something worth finding, something more valuable than money. And if Lambert hadn't found it, someone else had. The real criminal was still out there. Watching, waiting. And Verneuil had just stepped deeper into the game. Verneuil sat at his desk, staring at the flickering glow of his desk lamp. The hum of the city outside seeped through the thin walls of the precinct, muffled yet constant. Felix Lambert had refused to confess, but more than that, he had refused to lie. That was the most telling part. The man hadn't denied being in room 12, hadn't even tried to spin a story to shift suspicion. He was waiting. For what? For whom? He turned over the pieces of the case again in his mind, searching for the missing thread. Armand had money troubles, that much was clear. But money alone wasn't a motive for murder, not one this clean, this deliberate. Someone had been after something more than debt repayment. And then there was the woman. The unknown visitor Colette had seen. Who was she? Verneuil reached for his cigarette case, tapping it absently against the desk. He needed something concrete, something that would force the truth into the light. Moreau was convinced they had their man, but Verneuil knew better. There was another layer beneath all of this, a past that hadn't quite settled, a secret that hadn't yet died. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Moreau entered, a thick file tucked under his arm. "You're not going to like this," he said, dropping it onto the desk. Verneuil flipped it open. The name on the first page made his stomach tighten. Émile Renaud. A name he hadn't heard in nearly 20 years. A name that should have stayed buried. Verneuil exhaled slowly. Where did you find this? Archive records. Armand's name showed up in an old police file from 1909. Thought I'd dig deeper. Moreau leaned against the desk. Turns out our dear Monsieur Armand wasn't just a financial broker. He was a witness in a case you worked as a rookie. Verneuil's fingers brushed over the yellowed reports. The ink faded but still legible. The Renault affair. Émile Renault had been a small-time banker with dangerous connections. He had laundered money for criminals, funneled fortunes across borders, and for a brief moment had nearly been caught. But before justice could find him, he vanished. His disappearance had been a scandal, an embarrassment to the force. Some said he had fled to South America. Others believed he had been silenced by the very people he had served. Verneuil hadn't thought about that case in years, but now, here it was again, clawing its way back from the past. Moreau tapped the file. You ever meet Armand back then? Verneuil shook his head. No, I was just a foot soldier in the case. Armand must have been a junior associate at the time, probably involved in Renault's dealings but never charged. Moreau frowned. You think this has something to do with Renault's disappearance? Verneuil stared at the report, remembering the frustration of chasing ghosts, of following leads that evaporated like mist. If Armand was involved with Renault's finances back then, maybe he never really stopped. Maybe whatever got Renault killed or made him disappear is still in play. Moreau exhaled. You think Armand was hiding something from back then? Something someone wanted badly enough to kill him for? Verneuil nodded slowly. The old case wasn't just a footnote. It was the reason. A sudden thought struck him. He flipped through the pages, searching until he found what he was looking for. A list of Renault's known associates, names long forgotten, except one. Belmont Verneuil's pulse quickened. He grabbed the file and stood. I need to see Belmont, now. Belmont's home was exactly as Verneuil expected, tastefully understated, wealth without ostentation. The butler led him to a parlour where Belmont waited by a crystal decanter, pouring himself a drink. Inspector? He gestured toward a chair. I assume you've come with more questions. Verneuil didn't sit. He dropped the file onto the table between them. Émile Renault. Belmont's hand froze for half a second before he set his glass down. His face was carefully blank. That name brings back memories. Verneuil studied him. Not many people would remember it, but you would. You worked with him? Belmont let out a soft chuckle. I see your research skills remain impressive. Yes, I knew Émile, briefly, a lifetime ago. Armand knew him too. Belmont's lips pressed together. Yes. Verneuil didn't break eye contact. Was he involved in Renault's disappearance? Belmont sighed, running a hand over his chin. You assume Renault disappeared? Verneuil felt a chill. You're saying he didn't? Belmont swirled the liquid in his glass. You're a clever man, Inspector. Clever enough to know that men like Renault don't simply vanish. They either run or they are made to disappear. Verneuil's jaw tightened. And which was it? Belmont met his gaze. Which do you think? Verneuil didn't answer. He already knew Renault had been killed, and Armand had known the truth. Belmont leaned back. You want to know why Armand was murdered? He picked up the King of Spades from his desk, flipping it between his fingers. It's because he finally decided to talk, to settle old debts, and someone who had more to lose than anyone, made sure he never got the chance. Verneuil's mind raced. Who? Belmont smiled faintly. If you've come this far, Inspector, you already know. And suddenly it clicked. The missing piece. The real killer. Not Lambert. Not Belmont. Someone who had waited, watching, ensuring that the past remained buried. A ghost from the Renault affair. And now, knowing the truth, Verneuil realized he was next. Verneuil left Belmont's house with his mind churning. The pieces were aligning, but there was still a void at the center. Someone had killed Armand to silence him, to prevent a secret from the past from resurfacing. But who? And what had Armand been so desperate to reveal? The night air was thick with mist as he stepped onto the street. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, watching the tendrils of smoke curl into the darkness. He needed to shake something loose to force a reaction. A direct accusation wouldn't work. His killer was careful, deliberate. They wouldn't panic. But what if they thought the secret was already out? A plan formed. It was a risk, but it might be the only way to force the real murderer into making a mistake. The next morning, the newspapers carried the story. Murder in room 12. New evidence uncovered. Verneuil had fed them just enough, a vague hint that Armand had left behind something before his death, a document perhaps, or a letter, something that proved his knowledge of the past. Something dangerous. The reaction was almost immediate. By noon, Belmont sent a discreet inquiry through his assistant. By 2, Moreau reported that Colette had been asking questions, but the most telling response came at 4 o'clock when Verneuil received an unexpected visitor, the woman from the hotel. She arrived at the precinct, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but her hands clenched the edge of her purse tightly. "You claim to have new evidence," she said. "What is it?" Verneuil leaned back in his chair, studying her. "That depends. Why are you so interested, madame?" A pause. Then softly, "Marguerite Renault." His pulse quickened. Renault's widow. She had been little more than a footnote. In the original case, a woman who had disappeared into obscurity after her husband's so-called vanishing. But she had resurfaced now, drawn out by the fear that Armand had left behind something incriminating. Verneuil opened a drawer and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, placing it deliberately on the desk. Then he took out a pen and set it beside the paper. "Write down the name of the person who killed Lucien Armand." Her breath caught. Verneuil said nothing. He merely watched. The silence stretched. A minute, 2. Her hand trembled, but she didn't move. Then a flicker, just the smallest glance toward the door. Not an escape route, a hesitation, a calculation. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She was afraid of what might happen if she gave the wrong answer. Verneuil spoke, low and even. "You already know," she swallowed. A sound in the hallway made her flinch. Moreau, speaking to someone outside. Marguerite turned back to Verneuil, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand." "I understand that Armand was ready to expose something from the past," Verneuil said. "And someone killed him for it." He tapped the blank sheet. "But if you won't name them, I will." Her breathing quickened. "You don't know what you're doing." Verneuil slid the paper closer to her. "No, then prove me wrong." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached for the pen. Her fingers trembled as she wrote a single name. Verneuil read it, and suddenly everything fell into place. Verneuil read the name on the paper, and the weight of it settled heavily in his chest. It wasn't just an answer, it was the key to everything. The truth, was finally within reach. He looked up at Marguerite Renaud, her face pale and drawn, her fingers still clenched around the pen. She had risked everything to write that name, and now, for the first time, she looked truly afraid. Before he could say a word, a commotion outside the office caught his attention. Moreau's voice, raised, sharp with authority. Then a sudden crash. Verneuil was on his feet in an instant, hand reaching for his revolver. He moved to the door just as it swung open, revealing Moreau struggling with a shadowed figure, someone who had pushed past the front desk, moving with reckless urgency. The intruder turned, and Verneuil caught the briefest glimpse of a face, narrow, hard-set eyes, a gloved hand reaching into a coat. He barely had time to react before the man threw something, a small glass vial, against the ground. A thick, acrid smoke exploded into the air. Marguerite gasped, covering her mouth. Moreau cursed, stumbling backward as the office filled with the burning scent of chemicals. Verneuil lunged forward, but by the time he reached the hallway, the intruder was gone. The station doors swung open, and the cold air from outside carried away the last traces of the smoke. Moreau coughed violently beside him. "Merde! What the hell was that?" Verneuil's mind was already racing. That hadn't been a random attack. The man had come for something. He turned back into his office, heart pounding. Marguerite was still there, eyes wide with fear, but the desk, the paper, gone. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The name she had written had vanished with the intruder. He strode to the desk, overturning papers, searching in vain for any trace of it. Nothing. Just empty space where the answer had been. Marguerite gripped the edge of her chair. "He took it, didn't he?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Verneuil exhaled, his mind already shifting. This wasn't just an act of desperation. This was careful, precise. Someone had been watching, waiting for the moment when the truth would come too close. Moreau wiped his sleeve across his mouth, still catching his breath. Someone inside the station must have tipped them off. Verneuil knew he was right. The enemy wasn't just outside, it was within. Marguerite trembled. "What do we do now?" Verneuil met her gaze. The evidence was gone, but the truth wasn't. "We make them think we still have it." Marguerite's breath hitched. Moreau straightened. Verneuil's voice was calm, steady. "They went to great lengths to destroy that name, which means they're afraid of it. And fear makes people reckless." A silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. The real fight had just begun. The night pressed heavily against the windows of the precinct, shadows stretching long across the floor as Verneuil paced the office. The stolen paper lingered, in his mind, a silent accusation. The intruder had come too quickly, moved too decisively. Someone had been watching. Moreau leaned against the desk, his face still pale from the smoke. He was nursing a cigarette, though his hands trembled faintly. Marguerite sat rigid in the corner, her eyes fixed on the floor as if any movement might draw danger closer. "They'll come again," she murmured. Verneuil's eyes flicked toward her. "They can't afford to let me live," she continued, her voice brittle. "I was Emile's wife. I know too much." He watched her carefully. Fear made people talk, but it also made them lie. Marguerite was terrified, but something in her tone felt rehearsed, too polished. "You waited years to come forward," Verneuil said slowly. "Why now?" Marguerite's head lifted sharply, but she didn't answer. Moreau exhaled a plume of smoke. Maybe she didn't wait at all. Maybe she's been watching the whole time, waiting to see who else would break first. Her lips parted, indignation flashing across her face. I came because Lucienne asked me to. Verneuil's heart quickened. Armand sent for you? Yes. He wanted to make things right. Verneuil's mind churned. If that was true, Armand's death wasn't just about old debts. It was about betrayal. Someone from the Renault affair, still pulling strings from the shadows. But there was something she wasn't saying. Verneuil stepped closer. What did he ask you to bring him? Marguerite's breath caught just for a second. A crack in the mask. Verneuil's voice dropped low, pressing into the silence. It wasn't just memories, was it? Armand wanted proof. Her hands clenched. In her lap, knuckles white against the black lace of her gloves, he asked you to bring something from the past, something that could finally name Renault's killer. Her eyes darted toward the door, panic flickering beneath the surface. I don't... The sound of a distant gunshot shattered the stillness. Marguerite flinched. Moreau's cigarette tumbled to the floor. Verneuil was already moving, heart pounding as he snatched his revolver from the desk. "Stay here!" he barked, glancing at Moreau. The hallway was empty, but the sharp tang of gunpowder lingered in the air. The shot had come from somewhere inside the station. Too close, too deliberate. He moved swiftly, revolver steady in his grip, boots echoing against the floor. A second shot cracked through the corridor. This time, Verneuil pinpointed the source, the holding cells, Lambert. He reached the door, wrenching it open to find the night guard slumped against the wall, blood seeping through his uniform. A bullet hole marked the space between his ribs. His keys hung loosely from his belt. Verneuil's stomach twisted. He turned toward the cells. Lambert was gone. The door swung open on its hinges, the lock neatly picked. A distraction. They had taken the name, but they hadn't come for Marguerite. They had come to silence the one man who might have cracked under pressure. Footsteps echoed behind him. Moreau stumbled into the room, breathless. They got him? Verneuil nodded grimly. Lambert was never the killer. He was the loose thread. They needed him tied off. Moreau cursed under his breath. A chill settled into Verneuil's bones. Whoever they were, whoever had orchestrated this, they were still several steps ahead. He turned back toward the office, dread settling in his chest. If they had come for Lambert tonight, Marguerite. He broke into a run when he reached the office. The door was open. The chair where Marguerite had sat was empty. Her gloves lay discarded on the floor. A single playing card rested on the desk, the King of Spades. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. Verneuil stared at the King of Spades, the weight of its presence settling into his mind like a stone dropping into deep water. It was not a random choice. It was a message, a warning. Moreau swore under his breath, snatching up the card and flipping it between his fingers. What the hell does this mean? Some kind of calling card? Verneuil's thoughts moved faster than his words. Marguerite was gone, taken from right under their noses. Lambert had been silenced. The only two people who could have pushed the truth into the light, erased within the same night. But this card, this detail left behind so deliberately, was not just arrogance. It was familiarity. He had seen this before. His mind pulled back through the years, through files buried in dust, cases that had remained just outside his grasp. The King of Spades. It had surfaced in old reports, an insignia that had been tied to a network of carefully orchestrated crimes, ones that had never been solved, Smugglers, assassinations, disappearances, and now murder. Moreau was speaking, but Verneuil barely heard him. He turned, striding to the records cabinet in the corner of his office, yanking open a drawer and flipping through the files with methodical precision. He knew what he was looking for, and when his fingers closed around the worn edges of a folder, a grim certainty settled over him. He pulled it out, laying it flat on the desk. Moreau leaned in, his eyes scanning the aging paper. The photograph, clipped to the top of the report, was old, but the name beneath it had never faded from Verneuil's memory. Edouard Garnier. A former intelligence officer turned mercenary, a man who had vanished from the official record years ago, a man who had once been suspected of orchestrating a series of disappearances tied to high-profile corruption cases. Each time, the cases had gone cold. Each time, the only clue left behind was a single playing card. "He's back," Verneuil murmured. Moreau exhaled sharply. "You think he's the one pulling the strings?" Verneuil's jaw tightened. "No, Garnier was always a middleman. Someone else gave the orders." Moreau ran, a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Then who the hell are we really after?" Verneuil glanced at the empty chair where Marguerite had sat just moments ago. A pattern was emerging, but it was not about what had been taken. It was about what had been left behind. The missing note, the vanishing witness, the planted clue. Someone wanted him to chase Garnier. Someone wanted him to believe this was the answer, but the real answer was still out there, just beyond reach. And for the first time, Verneuil realized that the real mastermind had been watching him from the very beginning. Verneuil stood motionless, his fingers tightening around the folder as the implications settled in, the weight of it pressed against his ribs like a physical force. He had spent years chasing criminals who wanted money, power, or escape. But this was something else entirely. Moreau was still flipping through the pages, his expression twisted in frustration. "So Garnier was the one leaving the King of Spades, but you don't think he's the mastermind. Then why would he take Marguerite? What does she have that's worth all this trouble?" Verneuil's eyes flicked to the discarded gloves on the floor. She had been playing a game of her own, but not the one they had assumed. Not a desperate widow running from shadows. Not a witness who had suddenly grown a conscience. She had been bait. His pulse pounded in his ears. Marguerite hadn't come forward out of fear. She had come forward because she wanted to. Because she had been sent. He turned back to the folder, flipping deeper into the pages, past Garnier's photograph, past the reports of old cases gone cold. Then he found it. A name buried deep in the margins, an afterthought in an old interview transcript. A name he had dismissed before because it had seemed like nothing more than a footnote. René Vautrin, a judge, a respected official, a man who had been involved in multiple trials tied to financial corruption, but had never once been implicated himself. His name had always remained just outside suspicion, never directly linked to any crime. But his connections told a different story. Verneuil's throat tightened. He pulled another case file from the cabinet, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside, among a list of witnesses and suspects from a decade-old investigation, was a note scribbled in his own handwriting. Vautrin's wife, Marguerite's cousin, it all clicked into place. Marguerite hadn't been running from the people who killed her husband. She had been sent by them. She had never been in danger. She had been the one orchestrating the pieces, feeding them just enough truth to steer them in the wrong direction. The King of Spades had been a misdirect, the real crime the real reason. Behind all of this wasn't about silencing an old witness. It wasn't even about covering up the Renault affair. It was about something much larger. Moreau's voice pulled him back. "What is it?" Verneuil exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "We've been looking at this as a crime of revenge, a cover-up. But that's not what's happening here." Moreau frowned. "Then what is?" Verneuil shut the file with a quiet finality. "It's a test." Moreau blinked. "A test?" Verneuil nodded. "Vautrin has spent years moving pieces into place. He's been watching, waiting. He doesn't just want to silence people, he wants to see how far he can push them before they break, how much control he really has." Moreau's face darkened as realization settled over him. "He's playing with us." Verneuil turned toward the door, his jaw set. "Not just us, the entire system." Marguerite hadn't been a witness. She had been a pawn. And now she had been removed from the board. But the real player was still out there, waiting for his next move. Verneuil knew there would be no second chances. Vautrin had spent years orchestrating this, watching from behind the curtain as others fell for the traps he set. If Verneuil moved too soon, he'd lose everything: Marguerite, the truth, and any chance of proving what had really been happening all these years. But if he waited too long, Vautrin would disappear, slipping back into the shadows where no law could touch him. There was only one way to get him. The trap had to be perfect. Moreau was pacing, his nerves frayed from the pressure. "You're sure he'll come?" Verneuil nodded. "He has to." They had leaked a single piece of information, enough to shake Vautrin's confidence. A rumor that Marguerite had been found, that she was alive and willing to testify. It was a lie, of course, but Vautrin wouldn't know that, not yet. Verneuil could already see the man's mind working. A survivor like Vautrin didn't rely on brute force. He relied on control. He wouldn't send an underling to clean up the mess. He would come himself, certain that he could manipulate the situation, just as he always had. And when he did, Verneuil would be waiting. The abandoned villa on the outskirts of Paris had once belonged to a judge who had fallen from grace, a quiet, forgotten place where no one would come looking. It was the perfect setting. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old secrets. The dim light from the street lamps outside cast long, twisting shadows along the peeling wallpaper. Then just past midnight, a car approached. Verneuil tensed as he heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps outside. Moreau, hidden in the next room, had his hand on his pistol. But Verneuil didn't reach for his own. Not yet. The front door creaked open. Vautrin stepped. Inside, his figure framed by the pale moonlight. He looked exactly as Verneuil had imagined. Calm, measured, dressed in an impeccable dark coat, as if this were nothing more than another courtroom he intended to dominate. He closed the door behind him and spoke with quiet certainty. "Where is she?" Verneuil took a slow step forward. "Gone!" Vautrin tilted his head slightly, studying him. "If that were true, you wouldn't be here." Verneuil held his ground. "You came alone." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Vautrin gave a small smile. "Always." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Vautrin moved toward the fireplace, running his fingers over the dust-covered mantel. "You must understand, Inspector, that this is not personal." "It never was." Verneuil's voice was steady. "No, it was a game, a test." Vautrin's lips barely moved. "And you were the only one who saw the rules." The admission sent a chill down Verneuil's spine, but he kept his composure. "You knew I'd figure it out?" Vautrin inclined. his head. "That's why I'm here." Verneuil took another step forward. "Then you know how this ends." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Vautrin's eyes. Not fear, not panic. Something closer to amusement. "I wonder," he murmured. Then, in a single, fluid motion, he reached into his coat. Verneuil had been expecting it. Before Vautrin's fingers could close around whatever he was reaching for, Moreau stepped out of the shadows, his gun raised. "Don't!" Vautrin's hand froze. For the first time, Verneuil saw the faintest trace of surprise in his expression. Slowly, deliberately, Vautrin let his hand fall back to his side. "You were never meant to win," Verneuil said quietly. Vautrin exhaled, through his nose almost as if he were laughing. Then, just as smoothly as he had entered, he straightened his coat and nodded. "Then I suppose this is checkmate." Verneuil stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, this is where the game ends." Vautrin didn't resist as Moreau moved in to restrain him. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He simply let himself be taken like a man who had already played his final move and was content to watch the board be cleared. As they led him out, Verneuil couldn't shake the feeling that even in defeat, Vautrin had gotten exactly what he wanted. As the car carrying Vautrin disappeared into the night, Verneuil felt the weight of victory settle over him, but something about it felt off, as though he had solved only part of the puzzle. Vautrin had surrendered too easily. No anger, no desperate attempt to escape, no parting words of manipulation. Instead, there had been an unsettling calm, a quiet certainty in the man's eyes that suggested he had already accounted for his own capture. Moreau noticed the detective's hesitation. "We got him, Verneuil," he said, rubbing his face as exhaustion finally caught up with him. "It's over." Verneuil exhaled slowly, watching the tail-lights vanish. Maybe. The night felt too quiet. The villa's empty rooms echoed with the memory of their confrontation, but something lingered. Beneath the surface, something Verneuil had missed. He turned back toward the fireplace, replaying the conversation in his mind. "Where is she?" It was the way Vautrin had asked. The words were too careful, too deliberate. He hadn't sounded desperate to know. He had sounded as though he already did. Verneuil scanned the dusty room, his sharp eyes darting over the walls, the furniture, the floor. Then suddenly, he saw it. A single speck of white against the dark wooden floorboards, half hidden beneath the rug. A feather, small, delicate, out of place. His breath caught. He reached down, pinching it between his fingers. A memory surfaced. Marguerite's dressing room the night she vanished, the white feathers that had adorned her costume. His pulse quickened. "Moreau," he said, turning sharply. "She's still here," Moreau frowned. "What?" "Marguerite. She never left." Verneuil moved quickly, tracing the edge of the fireplace with his hands, knocking against the wooden panels beside it. The architecture of the villa was old, riddled with forgotten spaces. He stepped back, taking in the dimensions of the room, the unnatural way one wall jutted slightly further than the other. A hidden compartment. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Then faintly, so faintly he almost doubted himself, a breath. Verneuil's heart pounded. He grabbed the poker from the hearth and wedged it into the seam of the panel, forcing it open with a sharp creak. Moreau rushed forward, drawing his weapon as the compartment's secret door swung wide. Inside, in the darkness, sat Marguerite. Her wrists were bound, her skin pale, her once vibrant eyes dull with exhaustion. She blinked against the sudden flood of light, lips parting in shock. "Verneuil!" He dropped to one knee, cutting through her restraints. "It's over, Marguerite. We have him." Tears welled in her eyes as she sagged against him, weak but breathing. "No," she whispered. Verneuil stiffened. Marguerite shook her head, struggling to form the words. "Vautrin. He wasn't working alone." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Moreau cursed under his breath. "Then who?" Marguerite clutched Verneuil's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Her voice trembled, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "The judge," she whispered. Verneuil's blood ran cold. Judge Marchand. The very man who had once prosecuted Vautrin's past crimes, who had overseen the legal system that had failed to convict him time and again. The same judge who had publicly condemned him. A man who, if he had been pulling the strings all along, had now just let Vautrin take the fall for him. And now he was still out there, free, watching. Verneuil's hand curled into a fist. The game wasn't over. Not yet. Verneuil barely registered the sound of Moreau barking orders into his radio as he helped Marguerite to her feet. His mind was already racing ahead, assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. If Marchand had been pulling the strings, then Vautrin's surrender had been a distraction, a calculated move to make them believe the danger had passed. The real threat was still out there, watching, waiting for his moment to slip away unnoticed. Marguerite clutched his arm, her fingers trembling. "You have to stop him." Verneuil met her gaze, steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I will." He turned to Moreau, who had just finished relaying the new orders to his men. "We need to move. Marchand won't wait for us to figure this out." Moreau's face darkened as the realization settled in. "You think he's running?" "I think he already has a plan in place," Verneuil said, ushering Marguerite toward the door. "If we hesitate, we'll lose him." The car ride back to the city was a blur of sirens and headlights slicing through the darkness. Verneuil barely spoke, his mind working through every detail, every subtle sign he had overlooked. Marchand had positioned himself at the very heart of the case from the beginning, guiding the investigation, shaping the narrative. It was why the case had felt incomplete, even when Vautrin had confessed. The pieces hadn't fit because they had been arranged to form a picture that wasn't real. As they neared the judge's estate, Moreau's radio crackled to life. No sign of Marchand at his residence, came the clipped report from an officer. "His car is missing," Verneuil's jaw tightened. "Of course it is." The house loomed in the darkness as they pulled up, its windows dark and lifeless. Moreau signaled his men to move in, weapons drawn, sweeping through the rooms with practiced efficiency. But Verneuil already knew what they would find. Nothing. Still, he walked through the grand study, his fingers grazing the polished wood of the desk where Marchand had once sat in judgment over men like Vautrin. A ledger lay open, its pages filled with meticulous records. The ink was fresh. Marchand had been, here recently, making final preparations. A piece of paper lay discarded beside the ledger, its edges slightly curled. Verneuil picked it up, his eyes narrowing at the single line of text, "No man should stand alone." It was a message, a quiet taunt, and a reminder that Marchand had never intended to answer for his crimes. Moreau cursed under his breath. "He's gone. We lost him." Verneuil folded the note carefully before tucking it into his pocket. Not yet. He moved to the bookshelf, his sharp eyes scanning the spines until he found what he was looking for, a history of maritime law. an odd selection given Marchand's usual reading preferences. Verneuil pulled it free, and as he suspected, it did not resist. The hidden latch clicked, and a panel in the wall slid open. A narrow passage stretched into darkness. Moreau exhaled sharply. Of course he has an escape route. Without a word, Verneuil stepped inside, his footsteps eerily silent against the cold stone floor. The tunnel was old, likely built decades ago, leading toward the judge's private docks. The smell of salt and damp wood grew stronger as they moved forward, until finally they emerged near the waterfront. A boat rocked gently against the pier, its motor idling, and standing at the edge, bathed in the glow of a dim lantern, was Marchand. He did not flinch as Verneuil approached, nor did he reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. "You always were too clever for your own good," Marchand said, his voice almost amused. Verneuil stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. "You built the perfect illusion, Judge. You made sure Vautrin took the fall, and when that wasn't enough, you erased yourself from the picture entirely." Marchand smiled faintly. "Justice isn't about truth, Verneuil. It's about control. The world needs men who understand that." "You mean men like you?" "Men who know how to play the game." Marchand gestured toward the boat. "I leave you with a choice, detective. You can try to stop me, or you can let me go and accept that justice, as you see it, is nothing more than an illusion." Verneuil's hand hovered near his coat, but Marchand only smiled. "Do you really want to shoot an unarmed man?" "That would make you no different from the criminals you chase." Moreau stepped forward, but Verneuil lifted a hand to stop him. His gaze remained locked on Marchand, searching for the flaw in his escape plan. And then he saw it, the glint of a radio earpiece hidden beneath the man's collar, the barely perceptible flicker of his fingers as he signaled to someone. There was another boat. A backup plan. Verneuil's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a step closer, his voice calm. "You think you've won?" Marchand tilted his head. "Haven't I?" Verneuil smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You were right about one thing, Judge. Justice is about control." Marchand's expression faltered just slightly as a spotlight suddenly flooded the dock with blinding light. The roar of an engine split the night, and from the darkness another boat appeared, this one filled with uniformed officers, their weapons raised. Verneuil had called in the final move long before Marchand had reached the pier. The judge's jaw tightened as he straightened, his coat, his face unreadable. "Clever." "Not clever enough," Verneuil replied, "or you wouldn't have left loose ends." The officers closed in. Marchand lifted his hands in quiet surrender, but his eyes never left Verneuil's. "This isn't over, detective," Verneuil nodded. "It never is." As Marchand was led away, Verneuil turned back toward the city, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in muted gold. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the night settle over him. Justice had been served, for now. As the first light of dawn crept over the city, Verneuil stood at the edge of the pier, watching the officers load Marchand into the waiting patrol boat. The former judge didn't resist. He didn't beg, plead, or offer any parting words. He simply sat there, hands bound, staring out at the water as if already thinking of his next move. Moreau approached, rubbing a hand over his face. "You finally got him," he said, exhaling. "Shouldn't you look happier?" Verneuil didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, retrieving the slip of paper he had found in Marchand's study. No man should stand alone. A simple phrase, but the weight of it pressed against him like an unfinished puzzle. "It was too easy," he murmured. Moreau gave a tired chuckle. "Easy? Are you joking? The bastard almost got away. We were half a step behind him the whole time." "Exactly." Verneuil turned to him. "That's not Marchand's style. He was always a step ahead. He let us catch up. He wanted to be caught." Moreau frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. Why would he go through all this trouble just to be arrested?" Verneuil studied the note again. The words gnawed at him. Moreau sighed. "Look, I know you, and I know that look. But sometimes a win is a win, Verneuil. Let it go. You got him." Verneuil wasn't sure he believed that. An officer waved them over. "Detectives, we found something on Marchand." They followed the officer to where Marchand had been searched. The man held out a single item, a small brass key. Verneuil took it, turning it over in his fingers. There was no engraving, no indication of what it belonged to. Moreau peered at it. Could be a safety deposit box, a storage unit, who knows? Verneuil pocketed the key, a quiet sense of unease settling over him. If Marchand had expected to escape, he wouldn't have carried anything incriminating. But if he had planned to be caught, why hold on to this? His gaze drifted to Marchand, still seated on the patrol boat, hands resting calmly on his lap. And then, just for a moment, Marchand turned his head. Their eyes met across the distance, and he smiled. It was subtle, so slight that anyone else would have missed it. But Verneuil saw it. A knowing smile. A farewell. The unease deepened. Moreau clapped him on the shoulder. "You need sleep, my friend. Go home. We'll deal with whatever that key opens later." Verneuil nodded absently. But he knew himself too well. He wouldn't rest. Not yet. By the time he returned to his apartment, the city had fully awakened. The streets hummed with life, the early morning bustle drowning out the quiet tension that still clung to him. He placed the key on his desk, staring at it as if it might reveal its secrets on its own. He turned on the radio, letting the soft crackle of an old jazz station fill the space as he moved through his evening ritual, shedding his coat, pouring himself a drink, and finally lighting a cigarette. And yet the feeling remained. His gaze drifted to his caseboard, still pinned with photos and notes from the investigation. The intricate web of connections, motives, and lies that had led him here. His eyes landed on one detail he had almost forgotten, a name scrawled in the corner of a note. A minor player in the case, someone who had been questioned but dismissed. A name Marchand had mentioned once, in passing, as though it meant nothing. Verneuil's fingers tensed around his cigarette. He walked back to his desk, picked up the key, and turned it over in his hand. Marchand's smile lingered in his memory. This wasn't over. Not yet.